just have to think of all the political campaigns, of all the rallies, of all the conventions you've been to. I mean, you've done so much in that career of yours, but wow, what a year to be in the thick of it. Uh,
Yeah, it's an unusual year, obviously, and we're on the 50th anniversary today of the day Gerald Ford was sworn in after Watergate and the Nixon resignation. So these are historic times, certainly. And every election is interesting, none more necessarily than the other. But when something happens that never happened before, certainly in your lifetime, and in the way it did in nobody's lifetime, I think it's pretty telling as to how important and strange a year this is, in fact.
we led the show with the big news, I think, no matter how you square it, and I'm looking for you to square it a little bit for us, which is the new Ipsos poll, which prior to the emergence of Harris to replace Biden, had Biden trailing Trump by as much as 7 points. And this is both nationally and in swing states. The new Ipsos poll has Harris leading Trump by 5 points. Now, again, you can still say it's a toss-up, dead heat, et cetera, but you can't ignore that kind of shift in the poll, can you?
No, you can't. I mean, look, I think you know how I am with polls. I think that I would want to see more, certainly with a swing that big to make me think that this is in fact where things are. But there is no denying that the enthusiasm gap closed, as we here on the Mark Thompson Show predicted. People have been sending me clips. When I say people, a person who had a clip of me on the show, who isn't involved with the show, sent me, when I was talking to you, Mark, about how you've got to forget who Kamala Harris is now as the vice president, because once she's the nominee, it'll be a whole different ballgame. We can't even pretend to know what that would be like. There's so much hypothetical in politics that relies on the now, and so many people that rely on the now. For example, and I'll give you an example of this because I'm rambling a little off the subject of the poll. People are saying like, oh, if Walz was a good pick as long as they don't lose Pennsylvania. If they lose Pennsylvania, obviously Shapiro was the better pick, right? Well, that's not true. That's not at all true. You don't know if Shapiro would have been able to do what vice presidential candidates don't ever do, which is win a state. And let's say that he was able to close some of the gap. You also don't know what this news cycle that we're sitting in right now would have done to Josh Shapiro, would have done to Democrats who don't like him, would have done to, a dig into his past. So the Josh Shapiro that we know now would certainly not be the same Josh Shapiro, or most likely not be the same Josh Shapiro on election day. There would be many bad, tough news cycles from the Democrats, because we already saw that posturing. So you don't know what that effect would have been. So to say that if they lose Pennsylvania, it's because she didn't pick Josh Shapiro, I'm telling you in August, that's not the case. Now, going back to the polls and what we said about Kamala Harris is we knew that the Kamala Harris who became the nominee would get the embrace of a sort of apathetic Democratic base. And we knew that. We said it, right? We were just counting on those people to somehow show up and vote for President Biden. Now they have a reason to really get out. And you see, so many of these pictures from rallies on these stops she's doing around the country with her running mate that show that, yes, the enthusiasm gap has closed to nothing. As a matter of fact, I would now give that edge to Harris and Walz, and they have their convention coming up in 2 weeks. And then it will settle in after Labor Day, and we'll see where this race goes.
Yesterday, Donald Trump gave that, I'll call it a press conference. I'm really reluctant. I'm not just taking a cheap shot at Trump. I'm kind of taking a shot at the press. It was a hand-picked group, so maybe they're picked for this reason, but no follow-ups, a lot of softball questions. I mean, really softball questions where he could kind of just go any old direction. He did agree to the debate. I mean, I guess that's the kind of news that came out of that. And maybe he had a talking point or two that he started with, but it really turned into a meandering, I guess meandering would be a kind way to put it, sort of long-form riff during which he compared his crowd size to Martin Luther King, suggesting that he had a bigger crowd size than Martin Luther King's famous speech on the Mall. I'm wondering if you take the size of all of that, and maybe it's just a news cycle thing that gets chewed up in the news cycle, but how do you see these kinds of events for Trump playing in the race? Does it matter, or have people already baked in the fact that he's kind of nutty?
I'm confused by what Trump is doing and how their campaign's being run right now, because he doesn't look like he's going for the independent votes. He looks like he's going to shore up what he doesn't need to shore up, which is his blind support, right? And so I don't think there are a lot of people like the gentleman who wrote in earlier and donated to the show, who said he agrees with Trump on half of the things and Walz on the other half. And in that case, I always tell that voter they should vote for Trump, because they're voting for the president, not the vice president. But I still question how you get to that. And we saw it on display yesterday, the lying that was happening. He made up a story whole cloth about being in a helicopter that had to make an emergency landing with Willie Brown. Well, let's say he meant to say Jerry Brown, because he was in a helicopter with Jerry Brown. Willie Brown, the former mayor of San Francisco, said, "I never took a helicopter ride with Donald Trump. I don't know what he's talking about. That is a complete fiction." And what Trump is trying to do is bring up old, sort of scurrilous stories that made the rounds of Vice President Harris and the former mayor when Vice President Harris was coming up in politics. And he did it in that way. But I mean, Brian Williams lost a career for making up a story about being in a helicopter in a war zone. And people are saying they want this guy to be president, and he's making up stories, and then he's having these kind of rigged press conferences. And that's not how you win independent voters. That's fine if you're playing to your crowd, right? You do what you do. It's worked for you for whatever reason. We could go over that in history books. But if you're trying to win independent voters and you're trying to win a presidential election, yesterday was not, to me, the way that I would recommend doing it.
Somebody noted this. Delwood says, softball for Trump's presser. Mark, what about 10 days of love fest by the press for Harris? Come on, Mark. Well, first of all, I was asking a question about the Trump presser. That's why I didn't mention, the love fest. But I agree with you, and I would ask and turn this into a question for Michael Shure. It seems as though the press is playing along with the momentum that the Harris crowd has. Is that a fair take? Or, I mean, in that sort of the honeymoon period between Harris and the press?
I think there's a little bit of a honeymoon. Look, people in the press are human beings, and their audience are human beings. This is the first exciting thing to happen in this election for a long time. This is an unusual, historic, in the history of presidential election and politics. This may not ever happen again. And certainly it did happen. And everyone in the press is excited about it. I mean, whether you like this ticket, you like this candidate, you don't like them, it's an exciting thing for people who do what we do. And so I think it's, you do get a little bit of a pass at the very beginning. And that will not endure. That's why I said they're going to have their convention. That's going to be a love fest too. So Delwood's going to have to, grin and bear it for that. But it's going to be, it's going to be after the convention. Then it's going to be, holding feet to the fire if the press is doing their job. And I would say it hasn't been a universal love fest either. I think that you'll find the love in the usual circles, and you'll certainly find, I think it's been an intrigue fest, right? I mean, she had to pick a running mate, and that dragged along for quite a while. You'll recall during the time that Trump was out there picking or deciding who he was going to run with, the whole question was not about his running mate, but it was about the president's fitness for re-election. So from the 27th of July until June, until that convention, until that selection, everybody was preoccupied with how the Democrats were going to deal with a president who was fading. And that took up all the air in the room. Well, Kamala Harris's vice presidential search took up all the air in the room, because that's what the lead story was at that time. Not to mention there was an assassination attempt before Trump's convention. So there was a lot that mixed up that news cycle. Otherwise, there would have been the same kind of intrigue. This intrigue is very different. I say simply, from just the human aspect of it, it's different and it's exciting, and that will settle too.
There is another bit, I'll just, because of it's showing up in the chat here. I'll address it with you. Some states saying they will go along with cheating and fake electors if Trump loses, to go with that one comment on the screen. I don't know what the comment was, but let me just speak to that. I don't know if the states are coming out and saying they're going to go with fake electors, but what they have been exposed as doing is actually having those who are election deniers in positions of certification for the election. And they have essentially pledged, from what we see in reporting, not to certify certain counties, certain critical elections. That is playing out in the background of all of this.
It is, but I think, I mean, it's not blind faith. There are a couple of things that this is true, and there's reason that your viewers, listeners bring this up, because it is, it's really important, right? And you have a savvy audience. These are things that people should pay attention to. That said, what isn't being written about is how much money the Democrats are spending in states and federally on legal readiness for those things to happen. And there are many Republicans in the sort of Republican Party writ large, not necessarily MAGA people, but who've said that we realize if Trump loses, we're going to need to move on, and there's going to be a lot of fall off in support, not across the board and maybe not in the majority, but with the entire, apparatus of the Democratic legal team and the Democratic Party, and some Republicans, enough Republicans, certainly more than last time in a vocal way, speaking against that, then I would be worried, but I would know that it's not just a defenseless fight that's going to be put up.
Yeah, I think that it will be a lot of playing out in the courts, various arguments similar to what happened at the end of the last election, right? And as you say,
there are a lot of courts, Mark, that won't take it either.
Right. Okay.
That won't hear these things next time. And again, if the election was as close as it was in 2020, what I'm saying now doesn't apply as universally. But if it's a clear loss for the Republican side in November, then it's there. The teeth that argument has are going to be very weak, even if they have people in place who are going to make that argument.
How on God's earth, says Joan Jackson, is this old guy allowed to be running for president? The world would be more peaceful without this guy. Well, that's like, maybe. I mean, he has this, and this is a question, if I can just take this comment and kind of morph it into a question for you, because this is something we're chatting about last hour. He has obviously this insanely rabid base, many of whom you've spoken with at the rallies and you've had interactions with and firsthand experience with. But obviously he has to and you've just mentioned this a few minutes ago, he has to not only hold on to them, which is kind of easy because they're not going anywhere, but he has to expand that. So the question becomes, does he have a lower ceiling than we're perhaps giving him credit for? Like, or does he have enough of a ceiling? Is there enough upside potentially that he, and the race is so very close, that he can still be a little bit, if I can just use extreme, I'll use that word.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, well, that'd be easier answered in November. I mean, if I were Donald Trump's campaign advisor, he's speaking in Bozeman, Montana tonight, one of the reddest presidential states in the union. I would not send him to Bozeman, Montana, right? Because he's preaching to a choir there. And let's say people drive over. Where are they driving over from? The Dakotas and Eastern Washington and Idaho. And that's not who he needs to play with. He needs to go to places. He needs to go to swing states. I think perhaps they are a little leery of what happened when he sat down and spoke with the National Association of Black Journalists, and that went haywire. But they have to put him in the places he needs to be, because that's where this election is going to be won. And dispatching J.D. Vance to Pennsylvania, as he said he's going to do, may not be enough, because those elections are going to be won in Philadelphia and in Pittsburgh. If you go to some of the other cities like North Carolina, look, they got rained out of North Carolina and Georgia with Hurricane Debbie. I know that, but they've got to prioritize some of these states, and that's where they're going to pick up their independence. But that's why I say I'm, dumbfounded by this. I don't know why it just shows me that Trump cannot be corralled, right? This is who he is. This is what he wants to be. And playing to independent voters is too much of a calculation for him. The RFK voters, if you look at RFK's support, it's almost all for Trump now, now that Harris has entered the race.
It's very interesting that you mentioned RFK Jr. because he's the one guy who really lost in that Ipsos poll to which I was referring.
Yeah.
I think he lost 6 percentage points.
Yeah. Well, he's he's gotten a little weirder to everybody, to use a popular word on the trail this year. The story about the bear, which in and of itself is kind of strange more than anything, doesn't tell you about his politics. But I do think that independent voters who were uncomfortable voting for what seemed to be a challenged president and didn't want to do that, were sort of intrigued by RFK because they couldn't vote for Trump. Well, guess what? They have a place to go now. Maybe not all of them, but a lot of them do. I spoke to members of Students for Trump, and they all said before that they were sticking with RFK. Sorry, Students for RFK. They were all sticking with RFK when I first spoke to them in Milwaukee. I spoke to them again after Harris was named, and that support had eroded. And again, we're talking about 7 people maybe, but that 7 people is indicative. They were all in for RFK no matter what. And then Harris is on the ticket and they don't want to vote for Trump.
You always make the point that the running mates don't really matter unless there's a misstep or a problem. Then all of a sudden they begin to take on a sort of a supersized role. Things have been fairly cool in terms of the Walz edition, and there haven't been, in your judgment, any kind of bumps that would be deserving of any sort of special attention?
No, I don't think so. I mean, there's a bump, right? I mean, there is a serious...
they tried the stolen valor thing.
People are talking about stolen valor. That's not going to go away. That'll show up at a debate. That'll show up in talking points. But I'm so sanguine about it that I think that, I don't think J.D. Vance is going to matter either. This is an election about Donald Trump, and that's all that will matter here. And I don't think that any of the things that we're learning about Tim Walz that we already knew about Tim Walz, any of the people that are coming out to say them, it's a little different when it's the vice presidential running mate than it is when it was, let's say, John Kerry. As untruthful as those may have been, they were devastating for Kerry back in 2008, 2004. So I think that this one, Walz, seems to be pretty smooth, and he's a really good do no harm vice presidential nominee who, after Labor Day, I would imagine we're not going to be speaking about very much. And if we are, then I'm wrong.
The RNC is starving down ballot GOP, says No Contendo. Does this make the House and Senate easier wins for the Dems?
I thought the House was going to be tough for the Republicans to hold on to. I think it's going to be tougher now, especially when you have a daughter of California running, and a lot of those seats that are in play are in California and Southern California and Orange County. And then as far as the Senate, I still think that map is just as tough for the Democrats. I don't see that the presidential race is going to impact those because of where those seats are. Maybe Trump going to Montana is important because it lifts up Tim Sheehy, who's running against John Tester. Maybe there'll be some more excitement for protecting the seats in Nevada and in Arizona because you have Harris on the ballot. I think those races, but I think the Senate's going to be pretty tough. I think if the Democrats come away with a tie again in the Senate, they'll be pretty pleased.
I think John was asking about Montana. I made the same point you did about Montana last hour, that I just couldn't understand. I said it sort of sarcastically. Locking up Montana? I think, what is it, 4 electoral votes to begin with, but you've already got them. You never have to visit ever, and you'll have them.
Right. That's exactly right. So why be there? I mean, if you're in the driver's seat like he is not, and like I just said, if you want to go and bolster that Senate race, sure. If you owe that person in the Senate race and you're campaigning, let's say, in a swing state like Nevada, and you swing up to Montana just to do some goodwill stuff, that's fine. But this is an island of a rally in the middle of a place that Trump does not need to be. And I'm sure the Democrats are very happy about it.
Paulo, who is a Republican, says, believe me, we Latinos know how to identify irresponsible socialists when we come across one of them. Latinos support Trump, he says.
Well, wow. Some do, but the majority do not. And I don't know, and not all Latinos don't like socialism, nor is there socialism on the ballot in this election. So despite Trump saying it and Vance saying it and many of their surrogates saying it, no one here has espoused it who's on the Democratic ticket. So that's that label isn't there. If Bernie Sanders were on this ticket and you were making that argument, I'd say, well, there's something to be said there, though his Latino support was very, very high. If there's one group of voters in America that is not a monolith, it is the Latino voter. Whether you're an immigrant from Cuba, what you think of is very, very different than what you think of if you're a second or third generation Mexican American, or if you're a Venezuelan who has emigrated here and you're a second or third generation Venezuelan. The issues and the geography are very different. They're not a monolith. So I don't think just like if you look at any other voting bloc, right? If you look at the Jewish vote is not in any one way or the other. So I think that, yes.
Yeah, the word Latino, and as a Latino, let me tell you what we're going to be doing. I think right away, yeah. You can kind of, I mean, I take nothing away from, is it Paolo? But, even following Paolo's comments, there are other Latinos in the chat who are saying, hey, man, I'm not, that guy doesn't speak for me. So
exactly. And there are a lot of, so what you said is right.
Michael, is there and I'm getting this also, my Bolivian sister loves Kamala. It says, so
by the way, socialism thrived in Bolivia. Socialism thrived in Venezuela, and for a moment in Ecuador. So I mean, so just that label alone is not enough. Cuban Americans have a very different experience with it.
I mean, here, socialism, communism, they get thrown around as invectives. The reality is,
and they're not the same either. That's the other thing.
Correct. And there are aspects of, as we discussed before, socialist policies that exist in U.S. policy. You know what I mean? It also, in any case. The question I had for you is related to a number of different things I'm seeing in the chat, and I'll let you go after this. And that is, as you take the measure of things now, it's suggested in the chat by many that the things Trump is doing now represent a kind of desperation on his part. Do you see that reflected in the decisions that he's making, or do you just see kind of a general?
I actually don't. I don't see that desperation. I mean, I'm not trying to, disagree. I'd love to know why people think that. I see the opposite. I see him behaving like someone who thinks he's won the election still, and not looking at how the enthusiasm gap that we talked about has closed, and not seeing an Ipsos poll that shows Harris up by 5 nationally, and not seeing swing state polls tightening. Desperation is not going to Montana. Desperation is saying, I'm going to be doing 7 rallies in Pennsylvania over the next 2 weeks. That's desperation to me. That's like, oh my God, we could lose this thing. And I thought we were going to win it when I was running against President Biden. So I think so I don't see desperation. I see actually the opposite, but so I find it interesting that people see that.
PT asks, if Dems can't win the House and Senate, Michael, with Trump at the head of the ticket, when will they win?
Well, they should win the House, and I don't, and so I'll take that in 2 halves. So PT, they should win the House, and I will be as confounded as you are. The Senate is different because it really is dependent on in what states Senate races or Senate seats are up. So you could see, a Senate seat in Missouri up and say, well, how did the Democrats not win that? Well, Missouri is a very red state. So when Senate seats are up in deep red states, it doesn't matter who's at the top of the ballot because Trump will win those states anyway. It's when you look at a state that's purple, like Nevada, for example, would Jackie Rosen hold on to her seat in Nevada if it were still President Biden on the ticket? We don't know, but certainly the effect that the change at the top of the ticket has had, and the bottom of the ticket, I guess, as you look at that, that tells you that in fact there is definitely a better chance that the Democrats can hold the Senate. I was very bearish on Democrats in the Senate, Trump aside, but that's the geography. That's where these seats are up, and it's a bad cycle for Democrats just because of the geography.
Michael, so grateful always for your time. Thank you. I look forward to, the unfolding political season bringing even more interesting conversations to us. Again, we're sort of on final approach for the convention. And then after that, there'll be, as you've sort of suggested here in this conversation, a settling of things. and then it's a real sprint to the finish, I guess, right?
It is, yeah. Unlike what we've seen before. I mean, this is a truncated sort of UK type election,
Yes.
France type election, and that's kind of it's kind of something we're not used to. But the regular things are going to happen. There'll be a debate or two, and then there'll be, you know, down to the wire. There'll be an October surprise, and then there'll be an election, and let's see what happens.
Good stuff. All right. Appreciate you so much. Thanks, Michael. Michael
Thanks,
Shure,
Mike.
everybody. Hi, it's Mark, and I thought that was great. Hit the notification bell. You'll know whenever there's a new video being dropped, and please subscribe to our channel to help us save the universe.